we'll get started here. Let's go. This is Random Thoughts from County Antrim, and I'm your host, David McDonnell, and these are my random thoughts, which I intersperse with some stories and yarns and historical information, often about Ireland. Today it's going to be a little bit more about America, but that's what I do. So here it is for a half hour or so. Now, if some astute observers of this podcast may notice I have a little change in my attire, and that is I'm wearing a cast. I broke my arm on Wednesday. Now, I could tell you the story of how I broke it, but I don't want to. I simply will tell you that ice was involved in a parking lot. I did get to spend, as a result of that, a couple of hours in a emergency room, a small town hospital emergency room, and I'm going to see a orthopedic surgeon Tuesday, I think, is my appointment. Orthopedic surgeons, by the way, are called orthopods for short, which is a strange title because an orthopod just sounds to me like a name of an alien. I'm pretty sure it was Will Smith chased down an orthopod in the opening scene of Men in Black. But being in an emergency room was a different experience for me. It's been quite a while since I've been in one. I've been in one a lot over the years between me and my wife and raising 4 children. But I saw some changes in the ER, and I'm not sure if that's just modernization or whether it's pandemic related. But when I got there, they took me into a separate room, and I never left that room until I was discharged. I didn't go to a bed behind a curtain. I was in my own little room, examining room. And the nurse came in the room, the doctor came in the room, and other people doing all my vitals and doing the exam. And the doctor took a look at my arm and says, "Yeah, I think it's broken." But she said, "We're going to have to take an x-ray." So I waited around and thinking they were going to take me to the x-ray room. But instead they wheeled in the x-ray machine. It was on wheels. They wheeled it right into my room. It took the x-ray right there. Later the doctor came in and confirmed, yes indeed, I had fractured my arm. And sometime after that they wheeled in a workstation, and on that workstation they had all the goodies they needed, the felts and the wraps and everything else they needed to make me a cast. So I never left that examination room, and wasn't exposed to anybody else to give them the virus, or they didn't expose me to give me the virus. So again, I don't know if that was a pandemic change or if that's what ERs do nowadays. I've had to make some adjustments. The biggest adjustment I made is in typing. I've had to peck my way on my computer to get anything done, and I'm just having a difficult time with that. One of the smartest things I ever did in high school was take a typing class. Generation or so after me, they changed the name of the class to keyboarding, but in those days it was typing. And almost everybody in the class were girls, because there were girls in training to become secretaries, because that's simply what girls did back then. There were guys in the class, but most of them were there to meet the girls. Now, I was one of those guys. I didn't need to meet girls that way. I took the class because I wanted to know how to type. And I did, and I got quite good at it. And that skill served me well in college. I was writing 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 pages a week. I mean, it was just one after another, just what I did through college. There were always ads in the bulletin boards in the dormitories for people who would type your papers for you for $1 a page or 50 cents a page or whatever the going rate was at the time. But I just didn't need that service. I was quite good at typing my own papers. But I can't do that now. I can move this hand a little bit, but I can hardly move these fingers. You can get it in the picture. So I certainly can't type on my keyboard. Now, when the doctor was done with the exam, she gave me 1 opioid pill, plus a prescription for some more. And I also got the opioid speech. You probably know what that is. was that opioids are highly addictive. There'd be no refills. I could only use these pills as needed. And when they were no longer needed, I was to dispose of them properly. Now, I was a bit out of sorts. I mean, I had just recently broken my arm. And I didn't think to ask her, what is the proper way to dispose of an opioid? Because I don't think I can just take the extras and list them on eBay. And I don't think I can go to a park bench and just ask passerbys, strangers, hey, do you want to buy an opioid? I'm not sure that would work in a small town anyway, especially in the winter and during a pandemic, but I'm not the kind of guy that would do that. So, what am I going to do? What I'll probably do is just take my extra opioids, assuming I don't use them all, and just flush them down the toilet or put them down the drain in the garbage disposal. Now, I live in a rural area. I don't have city sewers. I have a septic field, a septic system. I think I have a pretty good ecosystem in that septic field, although frankly I haven't really checked it. But I feed it well. I think those the little microbes in there do pretty well. I'm sure at the end of the day they kind of get in a big circle and sing Kumbaya because they had such a good day. Now, I don't know if any of those microbes are in any pain, but maybe the pain will go away if I feed them my excess opioids. Now, hopefully they don't get addicted. If they get addicted, it might not take much because the microbes are just so small. It might not take much in the way of opioids to addict them. But if they get addicted, they might get angry. And I'm not sure I even want to think about what happens if I have angry microbes, angry addicted microbes in my septic system. But that's my arm. Now, speaking of angry, several people who watched my podcast last week asked me why I was so angry. And frankly, I was angry because there are a large group of people out there who are trying to take away my vote. I don't plan on repeating what I said last week. Instead, I do want to take a little while, maybe the rest of this podcast, and just talk a wee bit about voting. Not from a current perspective, but from a historical perspective. Because that's what I do. I talk about history. I have a passion for history, and I don't want to be critical of any of you who don't, which are in fact most of you. It's my passion, and I understand that things are the way they are because people made them so. And what angered me, I think, is that we became, and perhaps still are, dangerously close to losing something that people have fought for well over 200 years. So I'm going to take you back first to the year 1776 and the Declaration of Independence, in 1788 when the United States Constitution was adopted with the 10 Amendments, the Bill of Rights. And then we'll take kind of a quick leap over 200 years to get an idea of what I'm talking about. And show you that there are gaps between the language of freedom and rights and democracy that were incorporated in those documents and the reality. And we'll see how far we've come in those 200 plus years. And we'll see how far we have to go. And we'll also see, I believe, just how close we are to taking a giant leap backwards. All right, let's first take a look at the language. Declaration of Independence, wonderful, wonderful document. Let me just read just the part that you all have heard before. It's that we hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. That to secure these rights, governments are instituted among men, deriving their just powers from the consent of the governed. Powerful words. Now, let me read you just the preamble to the Constitution. It says, "We, the people of the United States, in order to form a more perfect union, establish justice, ensure domestic tranquility, and provide for the common defense, promote the general welfare, and secure the blessings of liberty to ourselves and our posterity, do ordain and establish this Constitution for the United States of America." Again, pretty strong words. Note what they say. They say that it's the people who are establishing the government. And it was the people who from thereafter will control the government. And they added the Bill of Rights to make it clear that there's certain things the government would never, ever do. Interfere with freedom of speech, freedom of religion, right of assembly, due process, that sort of thing. So that's the language of the Declaration of Independence and the Constitution. Now, the Constitution set up a framework to kind of implement those ideals. So who are these people with unalienable rights? Who gets to choose who governs us and has a say in how they govern? And here's where we see the divergence between the wonderful language in those early documents and actual practice. Now, the people who would vote, would make and decide things, were limited to, at that point in time, white males who owned property. Under the Constitution, states have the power and the responsibility to run elections, and states decide who votes and what process they use to vote. So the Constitution recognized at the time, when there were 13 states, that there would be 13 different election systems. And we haven't changed that concept, so now we have 50 different election systems. So in 1788, voting was limited to white men. And in most of those states, they were limited to white men with property. Now, why? Well, the white men part was easy. No one even thought of about the right of non-whites to vote. It was inconceivable. And it was almost as inconceivable to allow women to vote. The property owner issue was hotly debated. There was a great debate, and the fear was if only property owners could vote, the non-property owners could be oppressed. But if non-property owners could vote, they would likely be the majority, and they might trample on the rights of property owners. So what did Congress do? What did the constitutional drafters do? They punted. It says nothing about who gets to vote. They let the states decide who to vote. And the legislatures of all 13 states decided that only property owners, white men who own property, could vote. So that's how we started in 1788. Now, I'm a white man. I'm a U.S. citizen. I own property. So if I was alive and of age in 1788, I could have voted. And I suppose it would have been neat to walk into the voting booth and see the name George Washington on the ballot. And it would have been neat to check the box and have voted for George Washington. Well, would I have seen his name on the ballot? No. George Washington's name was not on the ballot in most states in 1788. Because even white men who owned property did not get to vote in the presidential election. White men with property could vote for their state legislators. And that's it. And the state legislators, every 4 years, then voted on a slate of candidates to be in the state representatives for the Electoral College. And then those state electors voted for president. And that's how it was done. So even as a white man who owned property, I could not have voted for the presidential candidates. That's how things were in 1788. Now, how did we get from there to where we are in 2020? And how do we get from where we are in 2020 to where we want to be? Well, I'm not going to answer those questions in detail, but I'm going to hit some highlights. And I'll show you that it's been a struggle for 230 years since 1788. And that struggle is far from over. First, let's look at that of property requirement. That concept kind of died in the 1800s, the early 1800s. And it was not because legislators became enlightened. It's because people, again, white men, who did not own property, demanded the right to vote. And that movement was the strongest in the frontier states, the first tier of states west of the 13 original states, Kentucky, Tennessee, Ohio, and virtually all the states east of the Mississippi. That was frontier country. When people moved there, established their territorial governments, and later became states, they demanded the right to vote, whether they owned property or not. And that concept was carried forward to all 50 states eventually. So that got rid of the property requirement. They also at the same time demanded that they could vote individually when they cast their ballots. They could vote for the president. They didn't have to limit themselves to voting for state legislators, who then voted for the electors. And that took decades. It was really, certainly by the time Abraham Lincoln was president in 1860, when that election, nearly all white men could vote, whether or not they owned property, and they could vote directly for the president and directly for the electors for the president. So when you look at that, it was a 6-7 decade struggle to expand the vote from white men with property voting for state legislators to white men voting directly for the president. 6 or 7 decades before we could get over that step. Now, what about black people? It kind of goes without saying that slaves could not vote. There were blacks in the South that were free, but they couldn't vote either. There were free blacks in the North. Some of these had gained their freedom in the South and moved north. Others were runaway slaves. In some states they could vote, some states they couldn't. The Supreme Court in the infamous Dred Scott decision in 1857 ruled that African Americans, free or not, African Americans could not and never be citizens of the United States. Among other things, they could never vote. Now, how did we resolve that issue? Well, we fought a war, if you may recall. We had to fight a war so that African Americans could become citizens and have the right to vote. And about 620,000 Americans died in that war. I'm speaking, of course, of the American Civil War. And shortly after that war, the Constitution was amended 3 more times. It was the 13th Amendment, 1865, which abolished slavery. There was the 14th Amendment, which did a number of things. It granted citizenship to all persons born in the United States, including former slaves. Granted all citizens equal protection under the law. The Bill of Rights, which I alluded to earlier, prevented the federal government from doing various things, abridging freedom of speech, infringing on due process, etc. The 14th Amendment extended that to the states, so no state could abridge due process or abridge freedom of speech. That was the 14th Amendment. And the 15th Amendment in 1870 gave the right to vote and said that the right to vote cannot be denied or abridged on the account of race, color, or previous condition of servitude. You add those three amendments together, amendments to the Constitution, and the language is quite strong. And the results of the American Civil War was really undeniable. So one would think that would be the end of the story. Black people and their right to vote as voters would live happily ever after, certainly, with those three amendments. Right? Well, the answer obviously is no. That's over 100 years ago, and it's continued to be a struggle for black people to vote over the last 100-plus years since the 15th Amendment. Some of those were quite overt legal restraints like poll tax and literacy test and limited black voting. The Ku Klux Klan and other people intimidated blacks from voting, hung around voting places, and punished blacks who did vote. We had a major effort in the 60s, which I remember vividly, which led to the Civil Rights Act and the Voting Rights Act and federal enforcement of those acts. And those largely ended some of the more conspicuous acts of voter intimidation. But since then, voter suppression has been a lot more subtle. It's usually under the guise of preventing voter fraud. There was extreme examples of that in Texas and in Florida this year in 2020. The state of Georgia has been historically very good at voter suppression. But I think they met their match in Stacey Abrams. And I think she and her colleagues deserve a lot of credit. And in fact, I think that's more than any other reason why Georgia ended up with a surprising result in the presidential election. But I think you can see that 230 years after the Constitution was enacted, we're still struggling with the whole issue of access to the polls by African Americans. Now let's turn to women. Now, of course, in 1788, women did not have the right to vote. They were much too delicate for such a thing, and their brains couldn't handle all the nuances of public policy, and they would be too emotional in their decision making. Or at least that was the thinking of the 18th century men who were making the decisions at the time. Now, what made the change? Why can women vote now? Well, it was the women who made it change. And a lot of this took place in the 19th century. Women became very actively involved in a whole variety of social movements. The abolitionist movement, temperance leagues, moral reform movements, religious movements. And women participated in these activities, and many of these groups had women as leaders. And they focused on getting men in political power, to change policies. And it didn't take terribly long for that to grow into a different movement. And that was to get women the right to vote themselves. And one of the seminal moments was a conference held in New York, Seneca Falls, New York, in 1848, where a number of activist women met. And among other things, they sort of rewrote the well-known line in the Declaration of Independence. They said, "We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men and women are created equal," etc. Now, the effort to get women the right to vote was another 100-year-long activity, 100-year struggle. Eventually, in the late 1800s, 4 or 5 states granted women the right to vote. In the early 20th century, 10 or 11 states in the early 1900s granted women the right to vote. But women didn't earn the right to vote nationally until 1920. That was the 19th Amendment, which basically said that you cannot deny or abridge someone's right to vote on account of sex. Now, I haven't spoke about some of the other struggles people have had to vote. It's only because I'm running out of time. I haven't spoken about Native Americans and their struggles to vote, or Hispanic Americans, or non-English speaking Americans. Right now there's, my dogs are barking in the background. What are you going to do? They haven't responded to my light that says do not disturb. But right now there are about 3 million American citizens living in Puerto Rico. They're American citizens, but they have no right to vote in American elections. I didn't mention 18-year-olds. Forever, 18 to 20-year-olds have been drafted into our military and have fought in our wars, but did not have the right to vote. It was in the midst of the Vietnam War that the Constitution was amended to require, prohibit denial of right to vote for anyone 18 or over. I didn't mention Washington, D.C. People in Washington, D.C. could not vote in a presidential election living in Washington, D.C. until 1961. It was another 100-year struggle for voting. In 1961, the 23rd Amendment was adopted, giving D.C. residents the right to vote. Now you look at a map, D.C. is a tiny little spot on the map, but there are more people in Washington, D.C. than live in Wyoming or Vermont. But again, a struggle to vote. I just hope, I'm going to wrap this up, I just hope you see why I was so angry. The efforts to set aside the votes in Michigan and as well as Wisconsin and Pennsylvania and Georgia, and I guess even New Mexico is now on the list, the hit list. It was just a giant step backwards, a 230-year step backwards. It was not only to take away the votes of African Americans, women, Hispanics, Native Americans. It was also an effort to take away the vote of men who owned property and men who did not own property. It was simply an effort, a conclusion by some people, that those voters could not be trusted. And it was a conclusion they could not be trusted because they voted, in the minds of these people, the wrong way. And their result, their remedy, what they want done, is to have the selection of electors the same way we did in 1788, the same way we did 230 years ago. Erase the progress we have made over 230 years, or the progress we thought we made in 230 years, and go back to the way things were in 1788. And that is what made me so angry last week. Now, I initially planned to wrap this up with a fable or something. This just kind of tied that together. But I'm running out of time, so I'm not going to do that. I'm going to think of a good fable, and I'll tell it next week. And hopefully this election stuff is over so I can focus on more fantasy, maybe some pandemic-related stories, because that certainly is not over yet. But in the meantime, take a look at my website. I've been doing a lot of work on it, and I'm adding a lot of content. It's looking pretty good. It's pretty up to date. I got more to do, but I'm getting there. Send me an email at clandonald@gmail.com. And my website, by the way, is clandonald.net. The email can be positive or negative. Tell me I'm nuts. I don't care. I'll be glad to respond. Take a look at my Facebook site. My Facebook page, just putting Clandonald in the search term, and send me a message there. I don't always look at my messenger, but I will. Send me a TikTok. I haven't had anybody send me a TikTok yet, so you can do that as well. So that's all for today. I hope you enjoyed this little walk through 230 years of history. And hopefully my arm will be in a different cast again when I see my orthopod. I can't do this so you can see it. Hopefully my arm will be in a different cast at my next podcast. So goodbye for now. I'll see you next week.